Hello, welcome back to Unschooled Theology. I am one of your hosts, Derek. With me, my co-host Evan. Good day to you, sir.
Good day to you, sir.
All right, we continue along the path of Genesis 1:28. We are going to look at the next bit of commandment in this verse, and have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the heavens, and over every living thing that moves on the earth. Now, I want to point out here, this does feel, in a way, like a restatement of verse 26, right? But here we see in this part, this is God speaking directly to humanity, not to the us that we saw in that verse. And we talked about that
Mhm.
previously in that episode. So while that verse states God's intention in creating man, this verse is God's instruction to humanity.
Mm.
And that is worth noting, I suppose, that is two different, though similar things, I guess.
Yeah.
Um, Now, in what this verse is saying, I guess we should look closer at these terms. And dominion here, this is often translated as ruling over the animals. And this again reiterates something we've seen before and talked about before, this idea of humanity being a level above the animals.
Mhm.
And that's what I think is really meant here by this dominion and ruling over them. Of course, this doesn't mean the animals couldn't, do harm to humanity.
Mhm.
Clearly, when the lion chases you down, you may have been created to have dominion over that animal, but it's not being enacted, I guess, in that moment.
Yeah.
Um, and the animals don't necessarily listen to your rule. So this actually ties into our previous episode that there is some level in which we're told to rule over them and told to have dominion over them. But clearly, to do that, we must subdue them,
Yeah.
which we saw in the previous verse.
Well, and it's a command, so it's not a statement of fact. You
Right.
have dominion over, and perhaps that's why it's important that it's stated to humanity, is that it is intended as an active role that you are intended to take on. And of course ties into our previous discussion about materialistic understanding and how that can
Yeah.
help in terms of enacting your dominion over something.
Yeah. So if we look at the previous verse in 26, that is God stating where man is meant to be in the order of things. Um, and that's in God's perfect design. Here is where humanity is meant to be above the animals. However, in this verse, we see the idea that humanity is going to have to play some role in placing themselves above the animals,
Correct. Correct.
if that makes sense.
But I mean, political leaders would be a good decent example of this. I mean, take any political leader who I suppose was duly elected and who is assassinated. If you take JFK for example, the fact that he was killed by somebody who was a U.S. citizen didn't any make him any less the president in that situation.
Right. Right.
He still maintained that role. It was just not effectively protected, effectively enacted
Right.
in the
Yes.
in the situation.
Yes. So we need to protect our role, I guess, as ruling over animals.
Yeah.
Now, the question emerges: well, what is this rule meant to look like? The answer here, of course, goes back to being the image of God, and so we would rule over creatures like God would if He were in our place. That is what the
Mhm.
rule should look like, and that's what exactly does that mean? I would point to it in some sense. We understand that there are animals. So let's look at it this way. Prior to humanity existing, assuming we're going to look at sort of an old Earth perspective here, there was animals going extinct at a very regular basis, right? And that is that was obviously not a result of humanity if humanity isn't around yet. You know, it was a result of other factors. So one of the ways in which humanity might fulfill this role is actually protecting animals from going extinct, preserving those species.
Mm-hmm.
And for instance, we look at the idea that one of the things that occurs on a regular basis and it upsets some people is a culling of wolves because they prove to be a threat to one of the deer species in a region. The
Mm-hmm.
wolves prove to be a threat to it, and humans step in and cull the wolves and sort of preserve the balance of the two creatures. Because the truth is, in the long term, if the wolves overpopulate and overconsume their prey, not only will their prey become extinct, they will become extinct for lack of food.
Mm-hmm.
So we as humans step in and help preserve a balance that allows both species to thrive in a way that allows them to continue dependent upon each other without one overrunning or domineering the other into extinction. And that's perhaps one way in which we might look at very surface level here what it would mean to sort of rule the animals in the image of God is to provide that balance. And so that is one of the ways in which we prevent the extinction of animals is through that process.
I have one small observation then related to our previous passage, and I haven't read these as separate things, but the command starting in midway through the sentence is be fruitful and multiply. I think those perhaps are conjoined, but then potentially replenish the earth and subdue it as conjoined. Because if you look at it closely, those two are very much associated with what you're describing right now, is that allowing the earth to replenish itself and build up the parts of it, but then also subduing the parts that need to be trimmed back.
Yeah,
right. And that need to be pushed down. And so that's an active role of replenishing the earth and subduing it at the same time, and knowing the proper parts at which you are supposed to allow things to grow and allow things to die.
Not related to animals here, but thinking again in that broader term of the earth, this is a little bit of the relationship we have with forest fires, right?
Mm-hmm.
There's a sense in which, yes, we can, protect a fire from getting too out of hand, but at the same time, one might argue that the severity of forest fires we have is because there haven't been enough forest fires, right? That have burnt out some of that old growth and allowed it to provide the fertile soil for new growth within these forests and within these lands. And so finding a balance there is worthwhile too, because fires could become so tremendous that they would destroy the habitat of a particular creature, if we want to bring this back to animals, and causing it to go extinct. But at the same time, not allowing the fires to proceed to some level and produce that new growth is also harming habitats for creatures as well. So there's a level in which we have to sort of find a balance there and do what you're saying, the subdue and the replenish. We need to treat fires in a way where we're subduing them in the right points and allowing them to replenish at other points.
Yeah, this whole passage then begins to make. We talked about last time how subdue has a lot of relations to science, but I begin to think that this dominion, as well as subdue, has a lot of relations with some of the other more abstract ways of thinking that are worth that it is worth humanity's time to spend to spend time dedicated to. Philosophy being, and more particularly ethics. How do we make these choices and how do we weigh things properly? It feels like this command, those studies are a natural outgrowth of this command. If you're
Yeah.
supposed to have dominion over something, well, it's potentially implied that you're supposed to have good dominion over. Well, what does it mean for the dominion to be good?
Right.
How do we weigh and balance different things that we can have control over and force over? And so, I mean, we've talked about this before, but this does result in the Christian then having direction to be ecologically minded and to potentially be thinking through questions of how do we influence things on our planet, and thinking through them reasonably, and not thinking through them in the way that tends to be the current form in which it is mostly humanity's fault for all of the ills that we have, with our ecological situations or climate situations. And so this is, again, a situation where it's important for the Christian to be a part of this conversation, because we wouldn't come into it saying we are always the problem. We would come into it potentially saying, how are we the solution to that? How are we actively involved, and how are we intended to have dominion over the earth? Not just humanity is clearly something bad, the earth would be much better if we were extinct. Well, no, that's probably not the case.
Yeah, without God's order, it's described as chaos, right?
Exactly.
And so humanity as the tool to bring order, we would look at it and say, okay, without our order bringing process, it's chaos. Now, we can, as we'll see with Adam and Eve, and as we get on here, we can contribute to the chaos. We can do that, or we can attempt to bring order in the wrong ways, which is something we're going to get to when we get to Cain and Abel. But yes, we would look at ourselves as the tool for the solution, not necessarily the cause of the problem. And as though in absence of humanity, everything would work out fine. What Genesis 1 is describing to us here is no. In absence of humanity, everything would devolve back into the chaos, right? Back into the disorder.
Yeah, that's what's important. And that's what's important about that's why it's important for Christianity to be a part of this, because the individual who void of this worldview, who notices the ways in which humanity is contributing to ecological problems, or notices the shortcomings of humanity, doesn't fundamentally look at humanity and say, we can be a part of a solution. It is very easy for that person to
we are meant to be the solution.
Exactly. Yeah. It is easier for the person to stray into humanity must be inherently a problem.
Right.
And that's one of the more I think insidious issues that you run into when you're following that so ecological protection.
If we look at Christianity in particular, right now, a lot of what you'll find in Christianity, again, I have problems with the Orthodox and the Catholic perspective as well, but there are particular problems that I see more apparent in Protestantism. And it is related to this, where we look at the earth sometime as this thing that we're just meant to burn through and run out every resource, and that's fine because there'll be a new heaven and new earth anyways one day. And so that's what it's just here for us to run through the resources while we're here. And I would argue what is being described here in Genesis 1 is it's really not meant to be that way. And in fact, while we're here, use the resources, but use them wisely, use them in a way that's in fitting with God's order, and don't, run a species out to extinction, right? Find a way to preserve it.
The simple argument to the Protestant would be then, how do you not know that the new commandment and the new heaven and the earth is the same as this commandment?
Right. And we would guess with the idea of our relating that to sort of to an Edenistic time or whatever. I would assume actually that's probably what we're doing in the new heaven and new earth, is that thing is properly fulfilling the role of image of God. And we would do that through this or something similar to this, I guess, would be what I would say. So, all right, there's one other thing I want to highlight in here as well. you mentioned actually specifically in verse 26 the omission of beasts of the earth when God sort of describes, you know, what man is created for. And here, though, so we hypothesized as that being something about the relationship between man and animals and God and man, and the idea of sort of an antagonistic relationship that, you know,
Mhm.
beasts of the earth are antagonistic to man, just as man can occasionally be antagonistic to God. But here we see the idea that even those animals are meant to be ruled by man, right?
Mhm.
That's included in God's command to us. And so that relates to the idea of subduing, right?
Correct.
We should bring those things under our rule. We should subdue them and bring them under our rule. And it foreshadows, I think, the idea that God will bring the antagonistic man under his rule in time, right? Every knee shall bow and every tongue confess.
Mm.
And so, just as we will bring the beasts of the earth, the antagonistic creatures, under our rule, and in a sense, we have done that almost as humanity.
Mhm.
I mean, I don't have when I leave the house, I have no fear whatsoever of being attacked by some animal of prey, and in
You don't
large
live in
portions.
Alaska.
Well, right, right. But even there, we have tools that drastically minimize our risk
Rest, yes.
of that. You know, I mean,
Yeah.
we have ways in which we have far less to fear from in terms of the beasts of the earth compared to you know, humanity at previous points, obviously.
Correct. Correct.
Um, and even if we go into the wilderness, we still have more and more tools to protect ourselves, whether it be, you know, bear spray or guns or all these things. Not that the bear attacks still won't happen from time to time. We're just better capable of dealing with them. And so again, I see that as a foreshadowing of God bringing the antagonistic man underneath his rule.
Mm.
So I just
Yeah.
wanted to relate that because you called that omission out before when we looked at that, and that was a good catch. And I think here's maybe what the difference between those two, between the sort of the stated intention of man to man. That's sort of what we're seeing there.
Yeah. That's very interesting. It definitely paints this out to be an active role, which we've mentioned a lot of
Yes.
times,
Yeah.
is that it's not a statement of fact, even though it might be,
Right.
because it was mentioned as a statement of fact, but it is
Mhm.
also a commandment to enact
Yes. Yes.
actively.
It's a statement of kind of the way things, you know, should be or would look like, but we have a role in bringing about that picture.
Mhm.
So,
Mhm.
all right. Well, with that, we'll wrap this one up, and we're finally going to move on to the next verses here in the next episode. So, be sure to subscribe and make sure you get that, and we'll talk to you then.